Dobrý večer, good evening. Welcome to the Václav Havel Library. My name is Michal Žantovský, and we have a very, very special evening ahead of us with a very special guest. But before I introduce the guest, I would like to give the floor to His Excellency, the Ambassador of Spain. Please.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to take more than 1 or 15 seconds to say thank you to both speakers, to both of you that are going to participate. I think that this can be the beginning of a very good conversation between two very important think tanks, one of Spain and the other one here in the Czech Republic. So I think that this is the value precisely of this meeting, is the beginning of this conversation between two very important think tanks. So therefore, a lot of luck. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I hope that it will be in the benefit of all of us that are going to listen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Your Excellency, and thank you also for the support that you personally and the embassy has given to this event. And now it is my pleasure and honor to introduce our guest tonight, Charles Powell. Should I say Professor Charles Powell? He's the director of the Elcano Real Institute of Strategic and International Studies in Madrid, a very prestigious institution. He's an Oxford-trained scholar and political scientist and author of a number of books on Spanish and international history, and my conversation partner tonight. And the topic of this discussion will be quite topical, I think. We've just finished, or maybe not yet, but we are in the midst of the celebrations of the 30 years of what we call the Velvet Revolution, and which marked the beginning of the transition to democracy in this country after 40 years of dictatorship and totalitarian rule. Now, Spain is one of countries that has or had also experienced more or less 40 years as well of undemocratic, authoritarian rule. Whether it was totalitarian rule or not is a matter of much discussion and argument about political scientists, but maybe that's not our main concern here tonight. But it has experienced a peaceful transition to democracy for a little longer than in this country, for about 15 years or 12 years longer, since Spanish dictator Franco died, and it has experienced some of the same progress and some of the same problems that are characteristic for a transition to democracy from whatever came before. And this is what we're going to talk about tonight. And as we get in our stride, we will get to more details, but first I would like to ask Charles to say a few words in the opening.
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for having me here, and for having me here in the wake of these commemorations of the 30th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution. I'm a historian of contemporary Spain, although I confess that nowadays I spend most of my time worrying about more mundane matters, such as the future of the European Union, structured permanent cooperation in the field of defense, the future of NATO. What the hell are we going to do about the transatlantic relationship as long as President Trump is in office? The bear in the room, in other words, our Russian friends. And I always like to say that, even if you're not interested in Russia, Russia is always interested in you. And this is something we have also discovered in Spain, apropos of the Catalan crisis. Spaniards have often believed that they lived in a world without threats, a rather postmodern world where power doesn't matter and threats are irrelevant. Well, thanks to the illegal referendum that took place in October 2017, we suddenly discovered that there were some gentlemen in Moscow and elsewhere who were following events in Spain with considerable interest. So that came as an interesting wake-up call. But we're not going to be talking about these issues. We're going to be talking about our respective transitions to democracy, and also, I suppose, the way in which they are perceived today, therefore the legacies of those democracies, and perhaps the challenges that we face, the social, the societal, the economic, and the political challenges that we face. Could I just say a few things?
Please.
I've been sort of thinking and writing about transitions to democracy in a comparative context for about 30 years. And one of the debates that has always interested me was the debate about the similarities and the differences between our Southern European transitions, which were the first of the so-called third wave that Samuel Huntington identified. You may recall Samuel Huntington was writing in 1991, and he observed an interesting phenomenon, which was that 30 countries had experienced transitions to democracy in a very short period, between 1974, starting with the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, to 1991 with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I've always been interested in the study of transitions in a comparative perspective, and there are two authors whom I want to recall in this context because they helped me to think about this issue. One is the German sociologist Klaus Offer, and he argued that it was unfair to compare Spain with the Central and Eastern European countries which experienced transitions after 1989, because in a sense, as far as he was concerned, Spain didn't have to face what he describes as the dilemma of simultaneity. What Offer was referring to was the fact that in countries like the former Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and so on, you had to deal with 3 or 4 types of transitions simultaneously. First of all, a political transition, in your case from totalitarianism to democracy. Secondly, an economic transition from a command economy to a free market economy. Thirdly, you had territorial issues, or you were basically in the business of regaining your national sovereignty. And finally, of course, you had a geopolitical transition because you had belonged to the Warsaw Pact and suddenly that Warsaw Pact no longer existed. And by contrast with that, Klaus Offer used to argue the Spanish transition was a pushover because Spain was already a market economy, already had a market economy when Franco died in 1975, because there was no geopolitical transition in the sense that Spain was already in the West. And therefore, as far as he was concerned, the only big task was the political transition, right? Well, I think this is unfair. I think it's an oversimplification. First of all, because the Spanish transition took place in the context that many of you will recall of the 2 oil crises of 1974 and 1979. And in fact, the decade 1975-1985 was the lost decade in terms of the Spanish economy, in terms of Spanish economic growth. So ironically, and rather worryingly for the people who lived through that, the political transition coincided with a period of very considerable economic and social turmoil. Secondly, of course, we had a problem that nobody else faced in Europe, which was terrorism. Now, of course, you are all familiar with one particular brand of Spanish terrorism, or terrorism that existed in Spain, which was ETA, the Basque separatist terrorist organization, which was active from the late 1950s until about a decade ago, during which time they murdered about 850 people. But this was not the only kind of terrorism that existed in Spain. We also had extreme left-wing terrorism from radical left-wing organizations which ceased to exist 30, 40 years ago. And we had a significant element of right-wing terrorism. One of the most brutal episodes during the Spanish transition, in fact, was the murder of 5 Communist Party lawyers who were mowed down as they were sitting in their office in January 1977. They were murdered in cold blood by these far-right thugs. So terrorism proved actually one of the biggest challenges to the transition and also the subsequent consolidation process. And then, of course, we had the territorial issue, which is so much in vogue today, as you well know. In those days, it was the Basque question that worried us most. Today, of course, it is the Catalan question, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. So my argument would be that Klaus Offer was right, in a sense. You faced a lot of simultaneous challenges, but the Spanish transition was not without its difficulties. And if I may, I'd like to mention a second author, the great Spanish sociologist Juan Linz, who was a professor at Yale University, where I met him when I was 23 or 24, when I was starting my PhD. And Linz, who was very good at drawing up typologies, he's the person, you may recall, who coined the term authoritarianism. He described for the first time what we nowadays generally mean by authoritarian regimes, which Spain was. I would argue that Spain was essentially an authoritarian regime, not a totalitarian regime, and that is fundamental for obvious reasons. But he argued that democracy, we can conceptualize democracy in terms of 5 spheres. And in a sense, he was agreeing with Klaus Offer, as I will explain in a minute. And those 5 spheres are the rule of law, what he called political society, economic society, civil society, and stateness, or statehood. So what's the argument here? The argument here is that democracy is not an event, it's a process. And in a sense, we are never fully democratic, or if you like, our democracies are always a work in progress, right? And Linz argued that Spain was quite fortunate because it had elements of those 5 spheres of democracy already in place when Franco died in 1975. By the way, the Spanish transition was probably one of the shortest. But Franco died in 1975. A new democratic constitution was adopted in 1978. There's a debate as to when Spanish democracy can be regarded as having been fully consolidated, possibly 1982 when the socialist power under Felipe González came to office. But let me very quickly review some of those 5 spheres. Obviously, in an authoritarian dictatorship, there is no rule of law, by definition. But there were elements of law. Felipe González has said this in Spanish, and it doesn't translate terribly well. He said that under the Franco regime, obviously it wasn't an Estado de Derecho, rule of law, État de droit, but it was an Estado con derecho. In other words, there were elements of the law which constrained the powers of the dictatorship. Secondly, political society. And this, as a historian, of course, is important to me because this is where history kicks in. It's obviously not the same to try to create a democracy in a country which has never experienced democratic institutions, free institutions, to the situation in Spain in 1975. Spain had a very rich constitutional history in the 19th century, possibly too rich. There were 5 or 6 constitutions. Maybe the country could have done with a few fewer. But there was a long parliamentary tradition. people knew about freedom of expression, political parties, etc., etc. So there were elements of political society already in place. And although political parties were illegal, of course, they existed. They were clandestine or they were illegal. Felipe González, whom you met later, was elected Secretary General of the Socialist Party in 1974, when Franco was still alive. And the police knew where he lived, as I will discuss later, because there's an interesting Václav Havel anecdote to that. So this was a sort of semi-tolerated, illegal democratic opposition. Secondly, the concept of economic society, which I think is a very interesting one. Juan Lintz's argument here is that obviously Spain was already a free market economy, so the institutions of the free market economy were already in place, the companies, the stock exchange, but also much of the regulation, the Bank of Spain, much of the regulation that accompanies a free market economy. And as Lintz points out, by the way, even the United States is a highly regulated market economy, something that our neoliberal friends don't always understand. So economic society was already there. Civil society. There's a big debate about the nature of civil society in Spain under the Franco regime, but the point I would make is that thanks to the extraordinary economic growth of the 1960s, between 1960 and 75, Spain grew faster than any OECD country except Japan, and this led to a complete transformation of Spanish society, urbanization, industrialization, de-agriculturalization, the growth of the service sector, etc. And in this context, a new labor movement emerged. You may recall the workers' committees, Comisiones Obreras, which the Polish organization Solidarity regarded as a bit of a model. You had a large and important student movement, neighborhood associations, housewives associations, etc. So there was actually quite a vibrant, autonomous civil society already in place before Franco died. And finally, the state. There is no democracy without a state. And as Thomas Carothers, another political scientist, reminds us, we have tended to factor out the state. We have tended to forget about the state in our studies of transitions to democracy. And the key thing here is that because Spain was an authoritarian regime and not a totalitarian one, it was possible to distinguish between the regime and the state. There was considerable state autonomy vis-à-vis the regime. How is this possible? Well, one of the interesting things that happened under the Franco regime is that for the first time in Spanish history, a rather meritocratic and rather objective method of recruitment of civil servants was created. As the economy grew, the state grew, and therefore the regime could no longer simply appoint its buddies and its cronies to the top jobs. Thousands of new engineers, architects, doctors, etc. were required, and these people were either apolitical or actually very often hostile to the Franco regime. The result of that is that by the time Franco died, much of the Spanish civil service consisted of people who were anti-Francoists, or people who were at least indifferent to the regime. So therefore, my final point, is that the Democrats, the people who carried out the transition, inherited what Juan Lintz calls a usable state. So we had these elements of these 5 spheres of democracy already in place. I'm contradicting myself already, which shouldn't surprise you, as you will learn in the course of the evening. But I think it's interesting to try and see, what the point of departure was. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Charles. I mean, as far as contradicting yourself, I wouldn't worry about it.
I'm in good company.
We're sitting in the Václav Havel library, and he's become famous as the dramatist of the theater of the absurd, and internal contradiction is
the essence.
The essence of absurdity. So you're among your own. Now, but let's try to make the comparisons a little more detailed, because much of what you say is undoubtedly true, and some of it would make Spain's transition look like the easier
walk in the park.
Not exactly the walk in the park. I mean, there's one element in particular that may have been more difficult for Spain than it was for us. I mean, our transition and its accompanying elements, even during the last years of the communist regimes, were totally non-violent. Yeah? The regime gradually used less violence. We didn't have the terrorist problem. We did not have a coup attempt that you had, and even the separation of the country Czechoslovakia in 1992 was done without a single window pane being broken. So that may have been our slight advantage. Our disadvantage, speaking of the 5 spheres of democracy that you refer to, I mean, in terms of rule of law, we did not have any, and it's something that's been problematic for a long time, and it's problematic still, because the doctrine of Marxism was that the law is what they say it is, yeah, and that the way they put it was that justice is institutionalized violence. Yeah, so it took a long time to come to terms with it. We didn't. That was a major difference. We didn't have even elements of market economy left in Hungary, in Poland, even in East Germany. There were little remnants of private ownership in agriculture, in small trades, etc., etc. Here, everything was nationalized, down to the hairdresser's shop at the corner, and when you went to have a haircut, you saw what it meant. So this took us quite a long time. The civil society, such as it existed clandestinely, and was, unlike in Poland, for example, where they had Solidarność, was largely limited to political dissidents, intellectuals, etc., etc. So, in terms of numbers, it was a relatively small group. In terms of statehood, I think there was your major advantage, but for me that goes even way before Franco, etc., etc. Spanish was an empire, and as every imperial nation, it had to build large administrations, large civil services, large classes of administrators and civil servants. We in Czechoslovakia, with the statehood always uncertain and running back 1,000 years, but through many reversals and losses of autonomy and rewinning autonomy. And if you look at our civil administration today, and if you look at, for example, Austrian, civil administration, you could see what having an empire, actually the same, the same family, meant to them. So statehood is to this day our neuralgic point. But there's one category that that we haven't touched upon yet, and we discussed it briefly when we were preparing for this, and that's in the non-tangible sphere. Another German sociologist, Ralph Dahrendorf, wrote a short book on the revolutions in Central Europe, based on the Burke's letter to a friend in Paris on the revolution in France in 1990. And in the book he distinguishes three phases of the transition. The political transition, which he says is very simple, or relatively simple, quite short. It can be done in 6 months. You can have an election, you can have a parliament, you can have a government. It's a relatively simple process. Then the economic transition, which he says is much more complex if you have to build the institutions of the market economy again, as we had to, and in the book he says it takes about 6 years. And then he goes on to say that the most difficult thing to change is the mindset of the people, and that it may take 2 to 3 generations to change that, 60 years. So by that measure we are somewhere in the middle of the transition still. And indeed some of our recent problems seem to be coming from that area, because we are doing undoubtedly quite well economically, as you are. We having some political problems, as you do, but nothing much different. As I said the other time, one measure of our progress that we finally advanced to the point when we are in the same mess as everybody else. And so changing that mindset is important, and one aspect of it that, as we were reminded time and again over the last few weeks when we remember the events of 1989 and a number of books came out, etc., is the problem of what we used to label as dealing with the past. There had been 40 years of totalitarian regime here. Several thousand of people died as a direct consequence of that. Many more, 10,000s, 100,000s had their lives ruined as a consequence of the regime, and many people still say that the justice was not done, that the real perpetrators got scot-free, that our attempts to deal with the past, which included the vetting law on public officials in the early 90s, the law on the delegalization or on the criminal character of the communist regime, several years later making all the archives of the secret police public at the end of the last century, were insufficient or ill conceived and didn't work. And yet, we have a sense of having tried, with whatever success. In Spain, you took a different road, and you drew the line behind the past. And there was, if you remember, in the early 1990s, there was a discussion of doing that, of drawing the line. and in the end it did not happen. And if some of our own past comes back to haunt us time and again here, doesn't it do the same even to a larger extent in a country where you drew the line?
Thank you. That's you've put a lot on my plate. There are lots of differences, of course, as we were discussing earlier, and one of the big differences is, in fact, it has to do with the debate about the nature of the Franco regime. You know, foreign correspondents often ask us, isn't it abominable that Spaniards are ambivalent about Franco? And, in other words, that according to polls, people who totally support Spanish democracy also have a relatively favorable view of some of the achievements of the Franco regime. And this is, of course, where we probably part ways, although I understand there are some Czechs who feel nostalgia about the past, the communist past as well. Of course, the point of departure is totally different, because the point of departure in the Spanish case is an extremely vicious and bloody 3-year-long civil war, which divided the country brutally between 1936 and 1939, in which about 600,000 people were killed. And of course, after the war, the victors, the Francoist side, committed brutal acts of repression, executing at least another extra 50,000 people. Now, given that background, you might assume that most Spaniards see this in terms of black and white. You know, Franco is another Hitler, and if you are on the right side of history, you have no doubts as to how you relate to this past. The problem, or the difference, is the longevity of the Franco regime that almost lasted 40 years. And although there was this neo-totalitarian phase in the Franco regime in the 40s, this was largely abandoned after 1945, when the Nazis and the Italians, when the Germans and the Italians lost the war. Franco rather quickly shed his fascist or neo-fascist clothing and adopted a more amenable facade, if you like, essentially in order to be able to survive in an international context where the United States had won the upper hand. And as I said earlier, one of the big differences is that Spain was part of the West. You could say that Spain joined the West through the back door, thanks to a bilateral military agreement signed with the United States in 1953. But the point I really want to make, though, is that during the second half of the regime, in the 60s and the early 70s, as I said earlier, although it obviously remained a dictatorship until the very end, the regime was also compatible with a spectacular process of social and economic transformation. The shift from an essentially rural to an essentially urban society, from an essentially agricultural to an industrial and service-based society. A society which modernized beyond belief, partly through things like mass emigration to Europe, which acted as a safety valve. And although, for example, press censorship remained very much in place, it liberalized after the 1966 press law. In other words, that for Spaniards of a certain age, the Franco regime was an era of relative prosperity, of relative personal safety, security, and so on. And this partly explains why there is no unanimity about the Francoist past, comparable to the kind of unanimity that you would find in Germany about the Nazi past. Right? I think it would be rather unusual to find Germans today of any age who would basically argue that Hitler was good for Germany. But that is not
surprised.
Well, there are some, yes, but you know, it's not a very widespread phenomenon. And I'm not saying it's a widespread phenomenon in Spain either. I'm just saying that, you know, this regime, which was in power for almost 40 years, and which was compatible with, and which to some extent facilitated this process of rapid socioeconomic change, is therefore the subject of considerable debate. Now, the other point I think one has to understand is that because there was a civil war, the goal of national reconciliation was an explicit goal. The Communist Party of Spain was the first political party, initially a totally pro-Soviet party, which moved away from Moscow after the events of '56 in Hungary and '68 here, and gradually later, in the late '60s, early '70s, became a so-called Euro-Communist party. As early as 1956, the Spanish Communist Party said, first of all, our goal is a Spain in which those who won the Civil War and those who lost the Civil War can live together. Secondly, and this is interesting, we do not seek revenge. Neither the military nor the police nor anyone in Spanish society has nothing to fear from a post-Francoist context. In other words, the possibility of punishing those who had supported the regime or made it possible or even committed acts of repression during the Franco years was ruled out by the left, the largest party, the largest anti-Francoist party being the Communist Party, as early as the 1950s. And this remained the official policy of all of the major anti-Francoist parties until the time of Franco's death in 1975. Now, dealing with the past, the most hotly debated issue with regard to the past is Spain's general amnesty law of October 1977. This is a very interesting law. So I'd just like to say a few words about it, if I may.
Sure.
First of all, this law was introduced at the request of the Communist Party and the Socialist Party of Spain. The goal of this law was to basically free all political prisoners from Spanish jails, including those who had committed acts of terrorism resulting in the loss of life. Okay? So Spain is quite extraordinary in that sense. The people who murdered the Francoist Prime Minister in December 1973, you may remember he was blown up in his car very spectacularly. The car flew 4 or 5 stories up in the air and landed inside a building, and when people arrived at the site, they couldn't see the car. They looked at this enormous hole in the ground, but in fact the car had gone somewhere else. So ETA, the organization which blew up this admiral who was Franco's alter ego, his right-hand man, all the people involved in that were freed as a result of this general amnesty. That wasn't very controversial, interestingly. What has become controversial, but wasn't controversial in the 1970s either, was the fact that this law also said that no servant of the Francoist state, would be punished or would be tried or would be purged for anything they might have done in the service of the dictatorship. Now, I want to stress that this law was approved by the Spanish Parliament freely, unlike what happened in some Latin American countries, where these laws have later been repealed because they nowadays are regarded as illegitimate. The point I want to make is that at the time, Spanish society thought that this general amnesty, which was a self-amnesty and an amnesty of those who had opposed the regime, was absolutely legitimate. It was popular and it enjoyed widespread support. 30, 40 years down the road, this law has come under enormous criticism. A lot of people, or some people, would like to repeal it. Of course, in a sense, it wouldn't make much practical difference because those who committed acts of repression have died, by and large. Those who committed acts of repression up to 1975 have died. But the argument is that this would have a symbolic dimension. So in general, this is part of a broader critique of the transition. And this critique of the transition basically argues that because of the negotiated nature, the non-revolutionary nature of the Spanish transition, because of the fact that, for example, the head of state was named successor by Franco himself in 1969 and became king in 1975, because there was no radical break with the past, and because the regime reformists basically negotiated the transition, or many elements of the transition, with representatives of the democratic opposition, the result is somehow lacking. it is not sufficiently pure, it is not pristine, and there are those who regret that Spain didn't experience something like the Portuguese Revolution, right? Which is actually rather strange to my mind, because it was a military coup, and I'm not very fond of military coups, whether they are left-wing or right-wing military coups. I'm not really sure that a regime born of a military coup is morally superior to one that is the product of a more evolutionary process. But the point I want to make is simply to make you aware of the fact that there are those in Spain who would argue that because of the amnesty, Spain has not been able to deal with its past. Let me quickly add a few things. This critique, this what I call a revisionist critique of the Spanish transition, strongly believes two things. First of all, that there was a pact of silence imposed on the people by the elites, and secondly, that the result was a collective amnesia. I refute both of those arguments. I think that it was much more sophisticated and subtle than that. Spaniards were fully aware of the past. They were very knowledgeable about the past, and precisely because they remembered the past, they set it aside, because they knew that if they put it front and forward, national reconciliation would not be possible, and democratization itself would probably not be possible. People have argued that this was not the way to do it. As I say, nowadays, of course, we have this wonderful new concept, transitional justice. The concept didn't exist in 1978 or 77. It was invented later in the context of the South African transition and some Latin American and some Central and Eastern European transitions. It did not exist in 1977-78. And Spaniards basically decided that this would be the first regime in Spanish history which did not try to pass judgment on the past, would not try to purge anyone associated with the previous situation, and would basically, as you very graphically said, draw a line in the sand. As Adolfo Suárez once said, the great political leader of the 1970s, I never ask anyone where they're coming from, I'm only interested in where they want to go. So there were no purges. And some people find this morally repugnant. But there's an anecdote involving Václav Havel and Felipe González that I want to share with you, which González shared with Havel when you and he visited Madrid in 1990. December 1990. They were talking about this question, how do we deal with the past? And Felipe said, I'm going to tell you a story. When I was elected Prime Minister, October 1982, the first thing I did was I flew to Seville, my hometown, because I wanted to share this with my mum. Right? I wanted to share the joy of being Prime Minister with my mother, who lived in Seville. And as I walked down the steps off the plane, I see a policeman coming up to me who saluted very smartly. And when I looked at him, I realized that he was the same policeman who had arrested me in 1974 when I was elected party leader. And this man, of course, knew that I knew, we both knew exactly what was going on. Nobody mentioned anything. And what Felipe told Havel was, this is a good thing. You know, this man would die for me. He would take a bullet for me. If someone tried to shoot me now, a terrorist or someone, he would take a bullet for me. So the same person who had arrested him in 74 was now in charge of the security of a democratically elected socialist prime minister. And I think that's a good story.
Yeah, and when Charles told me the story, I retaliated by telling him a story about the first time we went with the newly elected President Havel to the prison in Bori in Pilsen, where he spent 2 years of his life, and he had the guard that was personally assigned to guard him during his time in prison. He had him identified and brought forward, and of course the guy was terrified to death. But Havel just wanted to shake his hand because he said, you know, he always treated him rather in a civil way. So that's a similar kind of story, but it's not the whole story, Charles. And I have two questions for you. One is more or less a side question, but it has always intrigued me. I mean, apparently there were during the Spanish Civil War, there were not only casualties of the struggle between the Franco side and the Republican side, but there were also quite a few casualties in the internecine warfare between the Republican factions, and some of them at the instigation of Soviet agents or commissars, etc., etc. And that's also an aspect of the past that would call for some justice, because I mean, the Civil War. Civil War is a terrible kind of war, but at least it's a war. I mean, what happened behind the lines was sometimes sheer murder. It was not even war. So that would be my. I don't know what the extent of it was, but is it still reverberating in some way? And my second and more general question is, dealing with the past is is only in part about punishing the guilty, and this is, as you said rightly, this is an academic question today in Spain, because most of the guilty people are dead or in their 90s, etc., etc. But the other part of it is learning what really happened, is getting the truth out, and much of the transitional justice in Chile or in South Africa was more about learning what happened than about punishing the culprits. And this question is having to do with the accessibility of the information, with the accessibility of the archives, of witness testimonies, etc., etc. How accessible is that kind of information today in Spain?
Okay. As far as your first question is concerned, you're absolutely right. When George Orwell, innocent, young, extremely tall, and out of place, George Orwell landed in Barcelona in the middle of the Civil War, he found himself in a civil war within the Civil War. He thought he was there to fight the fascists, and he discovered, literally on day one, that there was a war between different left-wing factions in Barcelona. Basically, the communists, who had become the party of law and order, and who wanted to win the war first and carry out the revolution later, and the Trotskyists, who wanted revolution first, war later. And they were shooting at each other in the streets of Barcelona. And in fact, the Trotskyists, the party was called the POM, Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista, were destroyed, largely destroyed by a Stalinist-controlled Spanish Communist Party. So that's one of the sad legacies of that. There is an even more problematic legacy, which actually to some extent lingers on today, which is the rivalry between Spanish communists and Spanish socialists. Of course, the parties that lost the Civil War have been playing the game, the blame game, ever since the 1930s. And part of this blame game is about who lost the war. And many socialists blame the communists. And there are some very interesting figures. One figure is Juan Negrín, a very brilliant doctor who was prime minister, who was a member of the Socialist Party. And to this day, some people regard him as a communist mole who was effectively in the service of the Communist Party and Moscow and not loyal to the Spanish Socialist Party. There is no historical substance or evidence to that effect. But Negrin, his name is still mud. It's tarnished by these mutual accusations. And it's interesting that as late as the 1970s, during the transition itself, the Communist Party and the Socialist Party were rivals. For example, Felipe González refused to embrace Santiago Carrillo, the leader of the Communist Party, when the Communists formed a broad-based, multi-party, anti-Francoist front, the Junta Democrática, the Democratic Junta. So as late as 1975-76, the memory of the Civil War and these brutal divisions within the Spanish left was still alive. Going back to your second question, I wanted to mention the historical memory law of 2007. So I think it's blatantly untrue to argue that Spain has not tried to deal with the question of the past. What is debatable, of course, is the success, or otherwise, with which it has done so. And for me, this law has some positive aspects and some negative ones. The negative ones are, first of all, that it was not the result of a multi-party consensus. The Conservative Party did not vote in favour of it, and therefore conservatives in Spain regard it as an imposition of the left. Secondly, the whole question of memory. Is there a single memory of the past? Should we institutionalize a single version of events? As a historian, I find that slightly troubling. I think there is a difference between history and memory. History is an academic discipline which strives for the truth and a degree of objectivity, in the knowledge, of course, that it's almost impossible to attain. But memories are numerous. There are as many memories as there are people, and people are entitled to their own memories. But as a famous American author used to say, you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And this is becoming a problem in our societies generally.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think it was Mark Twain who there's a good quote from Mark Twain for practically everything. And if it wasn't Mark Twain, it's always a convenient reference. I think it was Mark Twain. But my point is, this historical memory law failed above all to deal with one issue. According to some estimates, there are about 100,000 Spaniards who died in the war who have not been given a proper burial, right? They are in mass graves, along the roads, unmarked. They are unmarked graves, and therefore, by definition, we don't actually know where they are. So this law recognizes this problem, but it doesn't provide the material resources necessary to address it. So as a result of that, in Spain today, we have NGOs and town halls and associations of various kinds using their own money, their own resources, their own expertise to try to locate those graves and exhume those bodies. As you can imagine, it's a very difficult, slow process. There's an interesting philosophical debate about this as well. Of course, Federico Garcia Lorca, one of Spain's greatest poets and writers and intellectuals of all time, was murdered, as you know, during the war in Granada, and they haven't actually been able to locate his body. He was murdered with some gypsies and some bullfighters. They were Republican sympathizers. They were killed together. And interestingly, the family do not want to know where he is buried, because they argue, and I think this is an interesting philosophical point, they argue that the greatness of Federico Garcia Lorca would, in a sense, be undermined, because in a sense, the tragedy of his life is that he was murdered, viciously murdered, and dumped by the roadside. And they don't want to identify his grave. They don't want to identify his body because they believe that that is actually the best testament to the way he died. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that I share that, but I just wanted to mention it. So the law of historical memory is problematic because it tries to institutionalize a single version of events to some extent, but it has positive aspects. As I've mentioned, it contemplates the exhumation of these 100,000 bodies. And also, a fascinating thing, you have to be a geek like me to have detected this, The preamble to the law is about 30 pages, which summarize all of the legislative initiatives approved in Spain by way of reparations for the victims of the Civil War. So ever since 1976, there have been dozens of laws, for example, providing pensions for the widows of Republican pilots, Republican sailors, Republican policemen, etc., etc. So this process of reparations began a long, long time ago, and that has probably been much more effective than these much more spectacular, controversial measures. Finally, let me mention that as a result of that law, General Franco was exhumed last month, and the world did not stop.
Yeah. So it seems that you've successfully exhumed at least one body.
Yes.
Yes.
A rather important one.
Right. So, well, it brings me to my last question, because I want the audience also to have an opportunity to join the fun. How much of this past informs the present? In this country, you know, we still deal with issues that pop up all of a sudden, and the next thing you know, there's a huge heated discussion about it, about some of the World War II memorials, about some of the victims of the communist justice in the 1950s, about some of the people who resisted the communist regime violently and are heroes for some people and criminals for others, or even, you know, the former past of our own dear Prime Minister, who at one time may have been or may not have been involved in collaborating with the communist intelligence, foreign intelligence arm of the secret police. So, does the Civil War still inform political events in Spain? And because of what you said about Barcelona and what Orwell wrote in homage to Catalonia, is there any relevance of this to the separatist or independence movement and to the solution of the Catalonian dilemma, or any other examples of this?
Sure. Well, I think it would be naive to argue that the past does not cast a shadow over the present. There has been a weaponization of history in all of our societies, including the most advanced democracies in the world. I'm fascinated by the debate about the Civil War in the United States of America. We thought, the 19th century was over, but not quite. And as you know, under President Trump, there have been events in the United States which have reopened some debates about that past and how America has dealt with its own history. I was mentioning before we started, there's a bust of Dolores Ibárruri La Pasionaria, the mythical Communist Party leader during the Civil War, which was apparently destroyed or damaged in Madrid the other day. And of course, this reflects the complexity of these issues. La Pasionaria, for some people, not only on the left, but perhaps some people who still view the 1930s with nostalgia, is the mythical person, the mythical figure that we associate with the defense of Madrid.
No pasarán.
No pasarán, exactly, against the advance of the Francoist troops. At the same time, of course, a few years later, she was happily ensconced in Moscow, defending the most outrageous Stalinist policies imaginable. And apparently she never got over the fact that her son was killed in Stalingrad and wore black for the rest of her life, partly because of that, apparently. So, how do we commemorate these figures? who were controversial as seen by contemporaries and continue to be controversial today. So the question, I think it's interesting, there were some interesting studies that have tried to identify when the past began to be problematic in this way in Spain. And a colleague of mine has identified the mid-1990s as the turning point. And she argues that, as you may recall, there was a socialist government in Spain between 1982 and 1996. And she argues that it was essentially the parties of the left which began to talk about the Franco regime and the Francoist past, which they had never done during the transition, and not during the 1980s either. They began to talk about the past basically as a way of embarrassing and delegitimizing the Conservative Party, the Popular Party, which then went on to win the elections in 1996 and 2000. It's not, I'm not attributing blame to one side or another. I'm just trying to point out that obviously the political uses of the past began to be discovered in the mid-1990s. And of course that game has continued, and it's a rather sterile game. You asked me earlier about archives, by the way, and the truth. Yes. I absolutely agree with you. It's truth, justice, and reconciliation. I think the reconciliation part of it has been achieved, and perhaps because it started actually even before Franco died. I would argue that Spaniards reconciled themselves before there ever was an official policy of reconciliation. Some of my foreign students ask my Spanish students whether they would ever marry or go out with someone whose family was on the other side during the war. And most of my Spanish students, you may find this incredible, but many of them don't know which side of the Civil War their great-grandparents or their great-grandparents were on. Obviously, their dating practices are not influenced by the political allegiances of their forebearers. Fortunately, I'm glad to report this. I'm very glad to report this. Archives, there's a lot of room for improvement. The Spanish archive system, and I hope my friends from the Cervantes Institute will forgive me, the archival system is not as open and as effective as it should be. As a historian, I've often had to use foreign, non-Spanish sources in order to carry out my research. This isn't really, I don't think, this is a result of obfuscation and a deliberate attempt to make access difficult. But for example, nobody has been able to write a good history of the armed forces because the military archives are largely closed. It also has to do, of course, with a lot of other internal institutional issues. But the point I want to make, though, is that this hasn't prevented historians from knowing a great deal about the past. We have very detailed knowledge of the repression on both sides during the war, province by province. I sometimes grow exasperated when someone shows me yet another PhD thesis on, the repression in the province of Cádiz, January 1936 to December 1937. They have identified every possible person. So that is possible. It's actually easier to do research on the 30s and the 40s than it is on the 50s and the 60s because it's more recent and potentially more controversial. But I would like Spanish archivists and the institutions, including the foreign ministry ambassador, to be a little bit more transparent.
So is it a matter of legal deadlines?
It is, but also, the Spanish law doesn't have an automatic declassification point beyond 30 or 40 years. There is basically, in order to protect the privacy of those who are mentioned in those documents, that leads to a very lengthy and complex process, which often results in phenomenal delays.
Yeah.
But the archives are there. The archivists are highly proficient, but I think the legal framework would need to change. But I think it has more to do with a traditional attitude towards these issues than a specific, a problem relating to the recent past.
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, on to you. Anyone wants to ask a question or address some aspect of what Professor Powell told us? Mr. Eichler.
Authoritarianism versus totalitarianism.
Yes.
Why do you, I mean, I understand the distinction, but could you elaborate?
Sure. Well, Juan Linz, who is one of my academic heroes, in 1964-65, he observed something very interesting, which was that there were only actually about 10 or 15 or 20 democracies in the world in the 1960s, and the rest were dictatorships. And we didn't really have the concepts, the conceptual instruments, the toolbox to describe those non-democratic regimes. And over the course of his life, he developed a typology, which by the time he died a few years ago included totalitarian, post-totalitarian, which would have included, I suppose, countries like Hungary, perhaps, and Poland in the 80s, authoritarian, and what he called sultanistic. Sultanistic regimes are those regimes where, for example, in the Gulf states, where there is no distinction basically between the political power and economic power. In other words, the royal family owns the country, to put it very bluntly. So what did he say about authoritarian regimes? And I think this is interesting because, of course, he used the Franco regime as a case study. First of all, these are regimes without clearly defined formal ideology. Instead, they are regimes which have a mentality. In other words, there's no Marxism, Leninism, there's no Maoism, there is no Mein Kampf, there's no formal structured ideology. There's a series of isms, if you like, nationalism, militarism, neo-imperialism, and so on. Very often anti things that existed, rather than in favor of anything specific. So, secondly, he argues most authoritarian regimes do not have single parties. And something I wanted to mention earlier is that although Falange, the famous Falanges party, was influential in the 30s and the early 40s, it very quickly dissolved, as a result of Franco's wishes, into a broader movement. So his argument is that in authoritarian regimes, partly because there is no guiding ideology, there is no need for a single party. Again, a big difference with totalitarian regimes. In every totalitarian regime, you have a single party structure. The third, possibly the most interesting aspect he identified, is what he calls limited pluralism. Now, we all know in democracy, in theory, we have unlimited pluralism. In dictatorships, in totalitarian states, we have zero pluralism. And he's talking about the elite level. So what he argues is that regimes like the Franco regime are authoritarian coalitions made up of different sectors. The military, the church, monarchists, technocrats, conservatives, etc. And the point he makes, which I think is very relevant to the transition, is that as long as you obeyed the leader and respected the leader, in this case Franco, there was, in fact, considerable room for debate over policy issues within the authoritarian coalition, which was totally inconceivable in a totalitarian system like the one you experienced. In other words, within this coalition, there was always a very lively debate about, for example, the role of the state in the economy, about foreign policy, about repression. How far could you go without it becoming counterproductive? About the succession, who's going to replace the dear leader when he dies, etc. And this structural element in authoritarian regimes, almost by definition, makes them weak. And finally, he also pointed out that authoritarian regimes, because they are more traditional than modern, they seek neither an intensive nor an extensive mobilization of society. Let me give you a few examples. Totalitarian regimes try to have youth movements and women's movements and sports movements. They tell you what to think about music and art and literature, all of that. Partly, of course, because they have a single party which can mobilize society. His argument is that authoritarian regimes are more traditional. They don't want to mobilize society. They basically want a demobilized society which will acquiesce and obey sheepishly. But they don't want hundreds of thousands of people on the streets, because by definition, authoritarian regimes are scared of the masses. So that's basically his category. And his point is that transitions to democracy are more likely to succeed if the previous non-democratic regime is authoritarian than if it is totalitarian or post-totalitarian.
Well, the last is an interesting point. But of course, philosophically, some of this goes back to Hannah Arendt and to the idea of the totalitarian system, unlike the authoritarian system, trying to control not only power, which is, the essence of the authoritarian, but the identity itself of the subjects in a totalitarian society, the mind, and that's why I think even Czechoslovakia in the 1980s already belonged to the post-totalitarian camp, because the regime basically gave up on the identity issue. No. And this distinction had a very important role in the Cold War. Another social scientist in the United States, the former U.S. Permanent representative to the United Nations, Gene Kirkpatrick, in the Reagan administration, drew the line between the Latin American or South American authoritarian systems, which could be open to limited partnerships and alliances with the Reagan administration, unlike the totalitarian countries of the communist bloc, which had to be confronted and fought. It was part of the Reagan administration strategy.
And she also thought that authoritarian regimes can evolve.
Yes.
They are more likely, perhaps, to liberalize in the future.
But the last point is very interesting, and I haven't thought this through really, but I'm just thinking aloud. Isn't it also a possibility that the totalitarian system, by virtue of being totalitarian, enables a clean sweep in a transition,
Well, Juan's argument would have been that in totalitarian states, the regime and the state are in totalitarian regimes, the regime and the state are one and the same thing. They are totally intertwined. They are impossible. It's impossible to separate them either conceptually or empirically. In authoritarian regimes, as I tried to explain at the beginning, the state has an autonomy of its own, so that when the regime collapses, the state remains. Yeah. So his argument would be going back to stateness.
And I accept it. Yeah. But that means that by necessity you import some of the aspects of the former
but as you were saying,
arrangement into the
as you were saying,
situation.
This may be an arrangement that goes back to the 19th century, and that may actually be quite.
Well, the reason I'm interested in this, because we still having 30 years later this debate about legal continuity or discontinuity of the communist regime, and I think this is one point we've failed to find a good solution for. So, next question. Please, in the back.
Thank you. Yes, I have a question, which is relative to, you were talking about the lack of revenge, which is fantastic, and these laws that politicians, they settle up. But indeed, I think that it's like a lack of explanation in Spain. And I will tell you a very short story. I was discussing with some friends about the history memory, right? And talking about these issues about to punish, not to punish, and so on. And I mentioned about Nelson Mandela and what happens some years after of democracy in Spain in the East countries. When I mentioned Nelson Mandela, which the lack of revenge and not punishing was avoiding probably a new civil war, they understood. And the discussion, I can say, was almost over. Do you think also that maybe should be more explained? Thank you.
Well, I'm an academic, so I talk for a living. So my answer, of course, is yes. You know, we can explain things until the cows come home. People ask me quite a lot about whether Spaniards know their own history, which isn't entirely connected to the debate about truth, let alone justice, but it is an interesting debate. And to be honest with you, I find that most of my university students are not very interested in the recent past. They are largely ignorant of the Franco regime. Many of them have not studied the Franco regime at school. So I like to think that my classes are actually worthwhile from that point of view, because for many of them this is the first time that they will have studied the Franco regime and even the Second Republic and the Civil War seriously. So yes, people very often assume that we know, or that the population knows much more than it knows. But at the same time, you know, even as an academic, I'm a bit reluctant to thrust my own obsessions on others, even though this is a very common thing for academics to do. You know, I'm not going to pass judgment on young people and, you know, say that they're a bunch of hooligans because they're not interested in the Franco regime. You know, in a sense, you could argue that this is actually a very healthy thing.
Yes, but it's also, this is another problems of the problems we may have in common. I mean, we finding the Václav Havel Library is involved in many educational projects, and one reason why we think we have to do it is that we found out, and other people found out, that modern history is badly taught or not taught at all in high schools and before the university level, and that kids spend a year learning about the Stone Age and then another year learning about the medieval ages, and then they have 2 weeks to learn about the 20th century, and it's over. We go home, and it's
a similar. It's in the curriculum. It's in the curriculum, but very often teachers, as you were saying, maybe we should swap stories and experiences about the teaching of history in the public sector. Very often teachers feel that, you know, they are conscientious and they want to cover the 18th and the 19th centuries properly, which were very rich in Spain in many ways, and they don't have time. Quite simply, they do not have time to cover the contemporary era. I really do not think it is in any way a result of self-censorship or, you know, lack of interest on the part of teachers. I think it's basically the way the curriculum is designed. It's brutally overloaded. But, you know, in Britain, the teaching of history is pathetic nowadays. You know, in Britain, our kids know a great deal about the Soviet Union, about the Nazi regime, about the Cold War, but they know very little of British 19th century history, which I think is a big shame. You know? They don't really know much about British political traditions prior to the 1930s, 1940s. So the debate about how we should teach history and what history we teach is a very rich and complex debate. I think, you know, in Spanish society as a whole, there is an enormous amount of information available for those who want to engage. The past, I think, is very present in Spanish cinema and popular culture. It's very much present in the media, I would argue. And therefore, you know, if you want it, it's there. However, as you were suggesting, you know, there may not be the kind of sophisticated level of knowledge that we would all like.
It's the same thing in here, maybe even more problematic, because we find that, you know, some of the teachers not only do not have the time, but they're not quite certain about how they should teach modern history and what their own relationship to the modern history is, because some of them, of course, have also taught history 30 years ago and more, so they may have some conflicts, internal conflicts to deal with. And it is true that it's largely compensated for by the vast amount of information that's available by many, not only us, even bigger civil society institutions and research institutes, etc., that produce masses of information. At the same time, the kids, are increasingly not into books, not even into television, not even into films.
Sure.
They online, and they can find all kinds of things online, and some of them are perfect nonsense. Some of them are reasonable, but someone has to try and help them to distinguish between what's nonsense and what's reasonable.
Sure. To be fair, if you Google Second Spanish Republic, some of the materials that will pop up in English have been written for Spanish secondary school students by their own teachers, right? Because some of the teaching is done in English now in some state schools, and those materials are actually quite good. So the knowledge is there, the ability is there, the interest is there on the part of teachers. There's no one teaching, because teaching is a very tiring activity, as you know.
Yeah.
Nobody alive now probably who was teaching under the Franco regime, unless they really don't want to retire. So that wouldn't worry me, right?
That would be a difference, yes.
Most public school history teachers are in their 30s.
Have to wait another 10, 15
not
years.
In their 80s, so. Right? So, these are complex issues. What kind of European history should we teach? Should we teach European integration history? If we had, Brexit wouldn't have happened. As you know, the day after the Brexit referendum, the most widely consulted question in Google was, "What is the EU?" Which is bloody brilliant, isn't it? Great news for democracy.
I'm going to Brussels the day after tomorrow to speak and then have meetings at one of the new European institutions, which is called the House of European History.
Yes.
And it's a rather controversial place, because at least as far as the history or recent history of this part of Europe is concerned, it was apparently not done by Eastern Europeans or Central European historians, but by our friends in the West who may have had a different perspective. I very much like the distinction you made between memory and history, and it's a very important distinction to keep in mind. There's more than one memory. There's ideally one history that we're trying to get closer to, never find really, but it's somewhere out there, of course. But part of the contemporary thinking also in some areas is that there is no such thing as history. It's only memory. And if that's true, so what you and I are doing is
waste of time.
Waste of time, yeah.
I suspected as much anyway.
All right, we have time for maybe 1-2 more questions, please.
Good evening, Mr. Powell. I have a little bit poetic question. In Czech political thinking, we have Czech political thinking includes famous writers, for example, Franz Kafka or Jaroslav Hašek with his good soldier Švejk. So I would like to ask you about Don Quixote. Is Don Quixote as a, you know what is the Don Quixote? Everybody knows this. Has some consequences in Spanish political thinking? Thank you.
I am actually one of the few people I know who has studied both volumes, both parts, the two parts of Don Quixote de la Mancha, because I studied Spanish literature at Oxford University, and I had a brilliant professor called Professor Peter Russell. If you are interested in Don Quixote, you should read one of the best academic articles I have ever read, which is called Don Quixote as a Funny Book. I think the title itself gives you an indication of, and he basically explores humor in Don Quixote. But my non-humorous answer to your question, I think, is not really. I think, you know, of course, we have the expression, the adjective, you know, to refer to people who are idealistic and not very practical and out of touch with reality, you know, because they are quixotic. But it's not actually something that Spaniards apply to themselves at all. It's something that foreign correspondents who work for the New York Times apply to Spaniards.
Well, I don't know if we're the same in this respect. It seems that Franz Kafka and Hašek, the author of Good Soldier Švejk, had a little more influence on us, and we have an indigenous perspective of Kafka, unlike the reporters from the New York Times, because most of the outside observers seem to believe that Franz Kafka was this dark visionary author of, you know, fantastic tales of alienation and absurdity. We know he was down-to-earth realist who was just describing, you know, what we live through every day of the week. So
a serious sociologist.
Yes, exactly.
An observer of reality.
And so was Hašek, of course. All right, please.
Václav Havel emphasized the importance of morality, and I would like to ask you, how do you create a moral society today in Spain and in the Czech Republic, and especially moral politicians?
I have no idea. I'm pretentious, but not that pretentious. No, really, it's a brilliant question, but I have nothing of great interest to share with you on that account. What is a moral society? I would try to create a law-abiding, humane society. That's as far as my ambition would take me.
Yeah, and as far as I'm concerned, I also have very little to say on the subject, but I would argue that you cannot create a moral society. A society with some sense of morality can evolve, and each one of us can, as Václav Havel would say, can contribute to it by confronting the moral dilemmas, first of all, in ourselves, and maybe try to bring them up in public, to confront other people's dilemmas, and to try to look for some kind of a stable or guiding sense of morality. But once you try to create a moral society from the above, you will end up with a totalitarian society, inevitably.
It's immoral to create a moral society from above.
Well said. Yeah, I see. Did I see a hand? Yes, I did. Even before the hand.
So I must preface this question by saying that I'm an American living here in Prague, and I work as
Lucky you. Okay.
No, I love the city very much, and I also must preface this question by saying that I'm under 30, and that I work as a history walking tour guide. And I encounter a lot of people from different walks, of life all the time. And I as an American, I see the kind of tear in the fabric of American culture with basically what is happening right now with like culture wars. I should also preface this question by saying that I'm from the South of the United States, which is obviously a large demographic of Trump supporters are. However, I myself am not. So I'm seeing this divide among my own friends, among my community, in a community where I grew up with a mostly homogenous culture from a base level. However, after the elections, it became quite clear that this culture, which we all thought was quite homogenous and quite friendly, was actually quite divided. And so now what we're dealing with is basically the comment section effect of InfoWars and fake news and all this stuff. And I find that a lot of my friends who mean very well in the comment sections, let's say, effect, policing other thoughts. And you've made the distinction between authoritarian regimes and totalitarian regimes, but it oftentimes makes me ask about totalitarian thinking. And even though I myself identify as someone who is, pro-LGBT and someone who is pro many of these things that are, you would say people my age are supportive of, it does make me question what is the right way to support these views without coming across as one-sided totalitarian thinking, but in the same way recognizing that these views are an effort try to preserve civil liberties and rights among people. Is there a point in fighting for this without seeming hypocritical?
You want to have a go?
Go ahead. That's a very thoughtful question.
This is a very thoughtful question,
expressed.
and I like the American perspective of someone who came here and experienced how we do these things, because until quite recently we had a very little idea of what a culture war is, and that's because this has been, I would argue, in public discourse, in literature, in the media, one of the most politically incorrect societies you could find. And one of the important aspects of this was humor, because humor is basically a survival device, and that's how it was employed by the Jewish people over the centuries in Europe, during the Holocaust, and by the Czech and Russian and Polish and Hungarian people during the communist era. We joke about everything and anything. Charles started this conversation by speaking of our Russian friends, and in the communist days the question went, are the Russians our friends or our brothers? And the right answer was obviously brothers, because friends you can choose. And and now this this mentality of culture wars is coming here as well, and people are suddenly thinking twice about using certain labels we've been using for centuries. Some of them are our own domestic labels. We have one minority, ethnic minority, which we have called gypsies for centuries, but these days it's not politically correct to call them gypsies, so we call them Roma, except many of them call themselves gypsies. So, and it's like the African American people who, you know, will call themselves black or even worse when they in their own, you know, circles. But if you use the word outside the context, it can be deadly. And the point I'm driving at is that, as George Orwell, Václav Havel, and other people have taught us, any totalitarian thinking and practice always starts with the corruption of the language. You know, once you tamper with the language and you start distinguishing between what's proper and what is not proper, if you can express this idea in a certain way or not, you're on a slippery slope. And by saying this, I'm not advocating hurting sensitivities of other people or being offensive to other people, God forbid. But we have to be very careful how far we're willing to go in this direction.
Thank you. That was a very thoughtful question, and I'm still thinking about it. And I don't want to be glib. It's interesting, you know, in Spain we don't use the concept culture war. It doesn't exist. Spaniards don't apply the concept to themselves in any way. Possibly because historically there was always such a strong left-right divide, you know, historiographically even. We have often talked about the two Spains, you know, a modern, progressive, outward-looking cosmopolitan Spain, and an inward-looking, reactionary, archaic, you know, isolated Spain. Obviously, not a very sophisticated approach to apply to such a complex and rapidly evolving issue. I'm fascinated by identity politics, which I think the United States is leading the way in, right? I read the New York Review of Books with fascination, partly because that is my my sort of road, my window into identity politics, and I'm both fascinated and horrified by what I see. I think Spain still has a slightly more traditional political culture and a more traditional political cleavage, although, of course, younger people probably wouldn't agree with me. People of your age, under 30, probably wouldn't agree with me. Older people, opinion makers, I think, still live in this post-transition world that we've been talking about, where you know, certain values and certain cultural and political traditions still resonate. But they mean nothing to my children. I have 3 20-year-olds who live on a different planet. I think it's planet Earth, but I'm not always sure.
Same here.
And they are not at all interested in anything I have to say to them about these matters, to be totally honest with you. But one of them volunteered for the Hillary Clinton campaign and went off to America. And he is now my political guru, because in the summer before the November, when Donald Trump was elected, he rang me up, and if you will forgive my French, he said, "Dad, we are totally fucked." And I said, "My dear boy, what do you mean?" And he was working for the Hillary campaign, manning the telephones, you know, calling people, saying, "I'm calling you from the Hillary campaign headquarters. Have you registered? Are you going to vote?" And the obscenities that people would come up with were just so shocking to him. He also noticed, of course, that most of the campaign workers had Bernie Sanders stickers on their laptops.
Most of the Hillary campaigns.
Exactly, not Hillary campaign stickers. So I think that basically, I knew then, I didn't really take him seriously immediately, I have to confess. Parents normally don't. But, you know, by the autumn, I was beginning to think, shit, my son was right. And he hit it on the head. So this was his introduction to these culture wars that are going to become so pervasive in the 21st century. And I suppose we do have culture wars in Europe, of course, very, very lively culture wars, although we still haven't totally imported the concept and the methodology.
No, maybe one aspect of this that you could address as an academician and as a British educated academician.
No one's perfect.
I know, but you know, this import of the culture wars is largely, my impression at least, is done via universities. It's becoming
That's very true.
Important part of the British university systems, and then it seeps on to the continent.
Oxford University is a far less free place today than it was in the 1980s.
I
assure
would
you.
agree. Yeah. And that's a pity, but we have to finish, and we don't want to finish on a dark note. So let me thank you all for coming, for your questions, for your attention. Let me thank Charles Powell for fascinating conversation, and you are all invited to refreshments courtesy of the Spanish Embassy. Thank you very much.